So the story I'm going to tell you now is one of appropriation. It's one of influence. And in many ways, it's a story of public address in India. And public address often gets slighted in India. We don't talk much about the powerful speakers in India. And we don't talk about how they gained their power over the masses in the audience that they spoke to eloquently. It's also one that has implications for rhetorical theory and what I would, tag as pragmatist rhetoric. What does it mean to be a pragmatist rhetor? How do you operate? How do you argue? Now let's go back to the ground zero of this story. That's Bimrao Ambedkar at Columbia University in Morningside Heights in New York, where he first met Dewey in class. There's three vectors of his engagement that I'll talk about today with Dewey. The first deals with his contact at Columbia. The second deals with his lifelong contact with pragmatism through the beloved books he continued to collect. And the third deals with how this impacted his views of social democracy and methods that became very prominent in his rhetoric. So let's start with the courses. Everyone knows he has a transcript. We can find this online. It's at various museums. And you could easily tether this to the instructors, to the archival bulletins at Columbia University. And so doing this, I find that he took 5 classes in philosophy. He took 3 from Dewey, and he took 2 from a realist opponent of Dewey's philosophy in the department, William Montague. Now, he drops those Montague classes, according to this transcript. So, I like to say when it came to Ambedkar's philosophical preferences, he voted for Dewey with his feet. So the classes that he takes from Dewey and he sticks out are the first of a 2-course section in 1914-15, Philosophy 231. And then the second one, a year-long segment in 1915 to 1916, Philosophy 131, 132. And as I prove in the book, that is the class that Husserl, the Chinese reformer who takes Dewey's thought back to China, that's the one Husserl was in. So Ambedkar and Husserl are sitting feet apart in this class where Dewey, in his very boring fashion, is talking about political philosophy. And then these two thinkers go back and start stories of pragmatism in China and stories of pragmatism in India. Now, in Philosophy 231, how do we know what was in there? This is something that's always bugged me. Everyone talks about how important his education is, but it's a black box. We don't know the content of it. The best they do is hold up stuff Dewey wrote with stuff that he wrote and say, it must have been the influence vector there. But so I dug deeper, and through the resources, the great resources of the Center for Dewey Studies at Carbondale, Illinois, I was able to find and identify the actual lecture notes that Dewey scrawled out for what he was going to say in class. I found student transcriptions that were most likely from that year. And so I was able to put together a very comprehensive picture of what he heard on an almost day-by-day basis in the fall of 1914. And what you see there, you see a lot of things, but one thing that I want to highlight to you now to set up the rhetorical point is the idea that Dewey's psychology in the 1910s was his kind of full-throated naturalistic psychology. It left behind Hegel, and it's focusing on impulses and habits and the optimization of those, the reconstruction of those through education, either formal or informal. So humans aren't bad for Dewey, but we can have our habits be more intelligent or less intelligent, more adaptable or less adaptable. And you also start to see how Dewey's psychology has a normative aspect to it. Our habits aren't just, ways of reacting, they're also ways of valuing, they're ways of reacting in a normative fashion. And as Dewey says in his lecture to these students, he says these are always attitudes. Habits are attitudes, but they're attitudes towards an object. And we'll see that kind of approach to the reactance of humans and the outgoingness of humans in Ambedkar's critique of caste. Now, Philosophy 131, 132 is a fascinating class. Ambedkar stuck with that the whole year, not just the first semester of it. And there he hears some very important concepts from Dewey that you will find elsewhere in Ambedkar's thought. I won't belabor them here, but one thing he learns from Dewey, and this was Dewey of the 1910s, force is incredibly important because means need some kind of force. And what Ambedkar would eventually worry about is the idea that force could go too far and destroy too much. So what you will see in a second is, I position his rhetoric and persuasive force as kind of a useful means that doesn't go too far and preclude things like community with others that you have to make community with. He also hears from Dewey the 3 values from the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity. I believe he heard those in March of 1916. Now, these aren't that important for Dewey. They don't appear much in Dewey's philosophy, but for Ambedkar, they become absolutely key. These things appear in many of Ambedkar's works. They're touchstones, consistent touchstones. And in the Constitution of India, you see this is the preamble, the first page of the preamble, that Ambedkar took a very heavy hand in drafting. 3 values are there, and they're they're not these are not Sanskrit values. They are values that come from the Western tradition, and so Ambedkar, the hybrid thinker that he was, saw a usefulness in those. We'll talk more about those in a second. The other thing, though, I think that is important to understand is, Ambedkar heard a lot of things from Dewey. Not everything Dewey thought, but he heard a lot of things, and some of those things, were insightful and useful for what Ambedkar wanted to do beyond Dewey's purposes, and some of those things were useful insofar as Ambedkar wanted to refuse them. So influence is a complex matter, and this kind of engagement with Dewey was not a simple copying. Ambedkar had a lot of agency, and he used pragmatism to get more agency. One of the things I think he was surely unsatisfied with in Dewey's thought, because he changes it so much in his own thought, is Dewey's idea that the individual and society are so closely linked that the optimization of social groups is really the realization of individual optimization and vice versa. Now, Ambedkar, as we will see, could never agree to that because the tradition, the groups, the customs he was enmeshed in India, according to his reading of caste, were the ones that oppressed him and his fellow untouchables. So he needed some role for the individual, and he needed some role for the reformer. Now let's talk about another vector. So after 1916, I've never found any evidence that Dewey wrote Ambedkar, tried to write Ambedkar. I've never found any evidence that Ambedkar wrote Dewey or tried to write Dewey. What I have found, though, is that among the 8,000 or 9,000 books remaining from Ambedkar's 50,000 book library, the most represented author is John Dewey. There's no other contemporary author, including Marx, that has as many books that Ambedkar owned or underlined as Dewey. And it's therefore is through his whole life, right? At the beginning of his life when he's at Columbia, and at the end in the 1950s, he keeps, a track of what Dewey's writing. One of the most underlined of these books is Ambedkar's Democracy and Education. He gets this in London after he's done at Columbia. And, he had 4 copies of this that I found. So this is the 1916 edition that he acquired in 17. And you see here he underlines in his characteristic style a kind of a key turning phrase in Dewey's thought. A democracy is more than a form of government. It is primarily a mode of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience. So Ambedkar saw a very key theme that Dewey's democracy was trying to emphasize, that democracy is not about voting. It's about communication, and it's about the habits and attitudes that drive our communication. He also saw one of Dewey's clearest enunciations of a sort of ideal for democracy in Democracy and Education. And this, the passage there, the boxes are my annotations, but you see how, Dewey says, it needs mutual interest being shared in a group, and a group has to have free interaction with other social groups. So there's a sense where democracy can be ideal in that way, or less than ideal in terms of truncated interaction. And when Dewey starts talking about things like the separation of classes, Dewey's not assuming caste, but Ambedkar surely hears caste. And that's probably why he underlines Dewey's critique of stratification as being fatal to true democratic society. And in the last years of his life, I've come across archival resources that, like this note card, and one of Ambedkar's ways of taking notes, where, after 1949, he's still paying attention to what Dewey's writing. So it was a kind of distanced, but very respectful and very interested relationship that Ambedkar had with John Dewey. And it was mainly with his work, mainly with his philosophy, not the person. Now let's start talking about rhetoric, because this I think gets fascinating. This is something I haven't had a chance to talk about in many lectures, but it's a key part of my book, and I go into it in many more details there. But when you start looking at Ambedkar's critique of caste, and you know about his relationship with Dewey, you will see pragmatism as kind of a structuring force in that. And you will also see kind of a pragmatist approach to rhetoric being an important structuring force in there. So let's start on his critique of caste in one of the most important works Ambedkar authored, and a speech he was supposed to give in 1936 that's known by the title Annihilation of Caste. And this speech was going to be so bombastic or so iconoclastic that the conference organizers, who were quote unquote upper caste reformers, so they were committed to much of what Ambedkar was committed to in terms of a ultimate goal of a caste-free society, they end up canceling the society, the conference, because Ambedkar's speech was going to be, so controversial. They actually postponed it indefinitely. So anyway, in this speech, Ambedkar ends up publishing it as a small booklet. In this speech, Ambedkar has a very forceful critique of caste. And, the idea of caste is very complex in Indian culture. It's something that's very contested now. You can look back at the Vedas and you see a notion of varna, which really translates to color, as being a kind of inner personality of, uh, you know, four different types of people. And the important thing Ambedkar notes in Annihilation of Caste is that, Varna and caste aren't just simply separation of labor in society. They're so tethered to the qualities of individuals, and those qualities inevitably get tethered to birth and karma. You see this as a separation of laborers. That's what Ambedkar says. It's not a separation of labor; it's a separation of people, of laborers. So, and by Ambedkar's time, for various reasons, caste gets multiplied. There's, thousands of castes. But, the core thing that Ambedkar focuses on, and you can find many of his readings where he, explains this. He's lived it, he's studied it, he's read, Indian and Western authors on it. So he has a very educated take on it, is that it's hierarchical and it's a kind of a descending ladder of contempt. Most castes are below some other caste and above some other caste. And Ambedkar found this to be a very pernicious aspect to it because it was hard to get the solidarity that revolution demanded. It was hard to get the solidarity that democracy dreamed of. Yet, a lot of those castes, especially the untouchable ones like Ambedkar, were excluded from many, if not all, the benefit, of the upper caste. So Ambedkar, says in Annihilation of Caste something that kind of struck me as surprising. He starts looking at caste, and our modern penchant would be to say caste is a system, or it's systemic, or it's an institution. But how he describes it is intriguing. He says caste is a notion, it's a state of mind. And to, destroy caste, you don't destroy physical barriers. You have to change notions or ideas or concepts. Now this became more understandable to me when I started to find the background in Deweyan psychology he was exposed to in 1914, where Dewey talks about habit as instances of a larger abstraction called customs. But these instances are matters of, how an organism engages a living environment or a changing environment. So you start to see the psychology of caste becomes extremely important for Ambedkar. And you have to diagnose this psychology of caste, and your solutions have to address it. So while later in his life, he of course would make sure that something was placed in the Constitution that outlawed caste discrimination. You see all throughout his life, his return to this deeper source of caste beyond just legal, rights or legal prohibitions. And, in that Annihilation of Caste essay, he was going to tell his audience this: all reform consists in a change in the notions, sentiments, and mental attitudes of the people toward men and things. And the names, and here he picks the foremost Varna caste descriptor names, and then, subdivisions can multiply, but he takes aim at the largest, most general kind of description of this hierarchy. And he says these kind of names are associated with definite and fixed notions and values in the minds of every Hindu. And of course, he and his fellow Dalits are separate and below these four names and labels. So an even more pejorative sense is attached when someone gets identified as that. That's Ambedkar's critique, at least. So Ambedkar, later in his life, after he's done with presenting the Indian Constitution, he embarks on a series of speeches and he starts preaching the benefits of Buddhism, and we'll talk about that in a second. But he also starts talking about social democracy as differentiated from political democracy. And here you start to see the Deweyan theme of democracy being more than a governmental structure. And you also see what Ambedkar does and did with those values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And, he starts saying that political democracy is great, but what underlies it and what is so important has to be social democracy, which is a way of life that recognizes and balances those three values. Now, how this relates to his diagnosis of the Hindu social order of his day. This is of interest. You find in his unpublished work, India and Communism, he refers to these values as touchstones, and he says, "Well, is the order that oppresses me a free one?" Well, let's look at the two criterion of a free social order, and the first one is oddly Kantian, where he says, "Is the individual an end in themselves?" And then he says the second one is, not so oddly Deweyan. Does it allow for the growth of the individual and the development of person's personality? And then he says, the way we do this is if your society is free in the sense of balancing liberty, equality, and fraternity. So you see this fascinating hybridity in his kind of moral philosophy that he's pushing forward. Now let's look at some more of that hybridity. Let's look at his Rhetoric of Reconstruction. This is the subtitle of my Chicago book, or the Chicago edition of it. You see later in his life, he comes very clear, close to just enunciating his pragmatism. So in Riddles in Hinduism, he critiques certain sorts of monistic philosophy in the Indian tradition as having good ideas, but as not bringing those ideas or theories back to practice or society. And a good philosophy must return to society as instruments of reconstruction. Now let's jump back to one of his earliest instances of public address. He addresses in writing and in oral testimony the Southborough Commission. This was in 1919, when the Brits were exploring ways of giving independence, or the way of giving independence or a franchise to Indians. And so Ambedkar shows up at this. He doesn't represent any organization. He's just back from London in the U.S. And he shows up. He's sharply dressed, and he speaks in eloquent English. And so he was it was like a bomb going off at this committee, because he came out of nowhere, but he represented so much when he was there. Now, if you look through this testimony, there's many things of interest, but a couple things that struck me is a few passages like this. You start to see him talk about humans living in community, and they share things like beliefs and aspirations. And then you look at what he underlines in democracy and education, and you start to see how he takes phrases or half a sentence here, or this term from Dewey, and he reworks it into his argument. So this kind of drove me, as a rhetorical scholar, to say, what is going on here? Why is he reworking the very language of Dewey? You see this also in 1936. You see it actually more in 1936 than you do in 1919. There's a whole bunch of instances I catalog in a middle chapter of my book where he, reworks phrases from Dewey, words from Dewey, terms from Dewey, and he reorders them. So he's not taking Dewey's point, but he's using Dewey as some kind of resource. So this is an, interesting sense of appropriation in language. This is Ambedkar using a certain sort of rhetoric. Here's another example where, he takes some of Dewey's critique of, capitalism, and makes it into a critique of the caste system, which almost inevitably tends to tether people's inner worth and inner personality to the jobs they have to do. So you see at the end of this, in a extra, part, he amends to the essay after the second edition, or in the second edition, where Gandhi has replied to it. He amends Gandhi's reply and his reply to Gandhi, and he uses a line from Dewey's Experience in Nature, where any act of thought puts the world in peril. He uses that to critique not just, philosophical views, but he uses this to critique religious conservatives. That's what he conceived of Gandhi as being, with his kind of, weak view on caste reform.